Hello and welcome to week 2 of the Jane Austen course on Southampton University's Future Learn. My name is Cleo and I am here at Chawton House, Jane Austen's brother, known to her as the Great House. And I'm in my office and I'm actually in the servants' quarters, the servants' attic. You can see my gown there. So this is actually not normally open to the public. So I'm giving you a sneak peek preview of where we all work and how we keep it all going. And also here with me is Emma, who you might recognise from the week one video. Sorry, I couldn't help it. You look great in that video. In her beautiful Regency gown and bonnet.
Yeah, not my everyday attire, sadly. Now I'm here far away in Devon, in a very bog standard office, far less exciting than your own. But no, my Jane Austen gown is nearby.
That's reassuring to know. And yeah, today we're going to talk about the things that we found interesting from this week and mention some of your comments. Beginning first with the leisure pursuits influencing Jane Austen's work. So I'll briefly talk about baseball because Deborah Grant, who is American, said she read it in Northanger Abbey and found it quite interesting that Jane Austen's talking about baseball. The quote is about Catherine Morland, and it was not very wonderful that Catherine, who had by nature nothing heroic about her, should prefer cricket, baseball, riding on horseback, and running about the country at the age of 14 to books. So obviously people were quite taken aback, like, oh, is Jane Austen an inventor of baseball? What is this? And we got into an interesting discussion, and Joanna Wood on the comments recommended a book by David Block called Pastime Lost, which talks about the origins of baseball. And from what he says, what Jane Austen would have played, the equivalent, apparently baseball in the early days didn't even include bats. The ball was soft and struck by hand. It was played by girls as well as boys, and by adults as well as children and the youth. And games could last a long time, and apparently it was more an occasion for socializing rather than competition. And beyond the bare bones of the game, not much is known. So presumably there were bases, because why else would it be called baseball? But it seems weird that there weren't even bats in it.
Yes, I mean, I was really struck by that as well. I've always considered baseball to be an American sport. I didn't know anything much about it. I mean, I'm a village girl, I suppose, so we have a cricket team. I've always been cricket, but I'd never really considered that baseball went back that far, or that it was such a sport played by so many people across the board. I mean, that's fascinating, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up cricket, because I was going to mention cricket myself, because George Knight, son of Edward Austen Knight, so Jane Austen's nephew, was a very good cricket player. Obviously, he wouldn't have been a professional cricket player, but sort of closest to the equivalent that he can be. And if you want to know more about, we have his painting actually. If you want to know more about George Knight, like I said, you can visit us and see his painting on the wall next to his sister Fanny Knight. But also you can read Hazel's book, The Other Night Boys, Hazel Jones. She's written pretty extensively on Jane Austen and the world around it. But her book is called The Other Night Boys. So talking about the Jane Austen's dispossessed nephews. So Edward Austen Knight had so many sons, and it just goes into detail of what they do. What does a gentry's born boy do? And George is described as having no necessary business, no profession, entered at Oxford, and properly idle ever since. So he is your quintessential country pursuing, gentlemanly second son, really. He initially is going to take orders, but then for whatever reason doesn't. Then he joins the bar, but even though he qualifies, he never once practices as a barrister. And then he plays cricket, and like I said, he's sort of written about and he's considered a really, really proficient, excellent cricket player. But he sort of lives at Godmersham Park, quite an idle lifestyle, kind of off his father and then his brother who takes over. And he marries sort of in his early 40s a wealthy heiress who I believe, and I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was Lord Nelson's sister or sister-in-law.
Wow.
So yes, so that is the life of a second son, sort of idle, dissolute in this case, not really sort of doing much.
No, that's really interesting though, considering the kind of place of not idle sons, second sons, in Austen, because you've got sort of Edward Ferrars, and he's not idle, I suppose.
Although he's the eldest, but he gets shafted.
Oh, is it his brother that? Well, I'm wrong. Yes, no, you're right.
He gets shafted and becomes sort of a second son, just in second in affections anyway.
Yeah, and Edmund, he's second, isn't he?
Yes, yeah.
That's what I'm thinking of. Yes, Edmund. But he's yeah, not idle, I don't think. So it's interesting. With Austen's own experience of her brother, and he's quite industrious, I think, Edmund, in a way. He seems to want to better himself, and his elder brother is the idle one, of course, gallivanting about and spending his inheritance.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and Henry Tilney, not that his elder brother is necessarily idle because he has a good career in the military, but yeah, she posits second sons quite sympathetically, and even Colonel Fitzwilliam. I was about to say Colonel Forster. That's Colonel Fitzwilliam. Yeah, I'm thinking about Lydia's elopement. Colonel Fitzwilliam, he sort of laments that he is a second son, so kind of has no recourse to do what he likes. And Elizabeth Bennet sort of says, "Oh, can you be that hard done by, being the son of an earl, even if it is a second son?" But sort of you are quite limited in what you can do. You have to find a profession, really, which is what all of Jane Austen's brothers did.
Yes, absolutely. I think in a way there's a sort of similarity there between the position of women and second sons, and the fact that they don't have as much. I mean, obviously second sons had far more kind of autonomy and options, but the fact that they had to find a way to support themselves, and women had to do that too, obviously through marriage, which is obviously one of the subjects this week. But I think there's an odd sort of sympathy perhaps between second sons and women in a not exactly egalitarian way, but just in that kind of way of needing to find money, needing to find subsistence, which is quite interesting, I think.
Yes.
Well, from sport, I suppose, to music, which is something that I found really interesting. The discussion this week I thought was really fascinating to do with music. The music book with all that music written out so perfectly, the amount of patience you'd have to do that, I think.
Yes, yeah.
And so well used by so many of the family. Marginalia is something I do a lot in my own research, so I found that fascinating. But the fact that was considered perhaps easy music to play is beyond me.
Yeah.
But in terms of it in Austen's works, I think a lot of people picked up on kind of Mary's performance at Netherfield and how that reflected badly on her social conduct. Philip de Stecquois, which I'm sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, he picked up on Elizabeth playing at Rosings, and I think a few other people picked up on that as well. And Samantha H as well also had a good conversation about that in that thread, about kind of how music covers the conversation that they have, and how it allows for a kind of coded conversation where they can say things that perhaps they couldn't say at other instances, or if they were being more obviously chaperoned. But something that I think I found really interesting this week was Julie S. said about Mary Crawford's harp and how it is brought to Mansfield Park in a barouche, and that's kind of a social status thing. But it's also, as Alison B. said, it's to do with Mary not being able to find a cart to bring her half up.
I saw that conversation. Yeah, people were very scathing of her, like, doesn't she know that farmers have to use their carts and things?
Yeah, it was an excellent conversation, I think, because that scene, it just shows, they were quite right, it just shows how little Mary is aware of everything else around her going on. And I mean, she's dependent upon the farmers ultimately for her food, but she's kind of unaware of that. And I think other people picked up on, or have previously picked up on, the fact that Fanny chooses not to learn a musical instrument. And I think this scene between a woman who has this kind of extravagant, ostentatious harp, and this woman who chooses not to learn an instrument, but that conversation shows that while she is of the lower class, she's more aware of the actual down to earth goings on of what's happening around her, and the fact that, you know, the carts ultimately belong to the farmers, so they don't have to lend them out.
It's theirs, so you can't just take it.
Exactly. And I think it shows, you know, it shows her kind of moral education. So I think that was a really interesting point to pick up on, because it shows Austen using music not just as a female accomplishment, but as something that can show lacking in a character, or perhaps vanity as well as accomplishment. And ultimately, obviously, these are the two love interests for Edmund, and he chooses Fanny in the end, which is perhaps Austen's picking moral education over musical education, which I thought was really interesting. And I suppose in terms of picking a life partner and getting married, I was interested in the Directory of Women. I don't know, what did you think about the Directory of Women?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my immediate thought upon reading it was, oh, it's satire. And then I sort of was questioning myself, like, but is it satire? I don't know now, because it's so sort of detailed. I assumed it was satire because the most eligible dowager was the Duchess of Marlborough, who would have been, I'm not sure how old she would have been at the time, but she was not of a marrying age, and her sort of net worth is just described as millions. So it's yeah,
absolutely, yeah, it's a fascinating record. I think that idea of satire or sincerity is really interesting. I'm not sure it's something that I can answer.
It's a great resource, I think, for any historical writer, because it gives a sense of how much money was floating around and what it kind of, well, maybe not what it means, but just you can see where on the scale you want a character to sort of fit or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a way that we don't really have the same kind of idea of earnings, money, that we do, unless it's sort of very, very high, kind of Jeff Bezos, and yeah, that's an area. But Vanessa S's comment, did you see it? I found it really interesting. She compared the directory to Tinder in kind of modern day, which, I mean, I think it's a really fascinating comparison, really, about the kind of performative nature of it, I suppose, and being judged by other people on what might be considered superficial, or in terms of marrying, perhaps very important criteria, but being laid out in a kind of codex of one form or another, kind of book or Tinder. I found that really fascinating. I don't know what you think about that idea.
Wow, because I guess all I'd say is Tinder, we sort of, one creates one's own profile, whereas obviously this is sort of created as a list by a sort of mysterious, again, a second son. So hence why it's on my brain. But so I suppose that's sort of the difference. Yeah, sort of maybe in Tinder you can, to a degree, control how you're perceived, whereas on this it's sort of all the facts are public knowledge now, whether you want them to be or not.
Yeah, that's true. I think, yeah, perhaps more autonomy in Tinder, and you know, or Tinder isn't just female oriented, as it goes both ways as well.
Oh yes, good point. Interesting.
Yeah. But in terms of money, I think you have a recommendation for everybody.
Yes, I do. So if you want to know more about wealth and what they mean in real terms in the Jane Austen world, then Alison Daniel, who wrote several of the articles for the course, she, for the previous Future Learn Roundup, covered in week 2 finances and also the Matrimonial Act, but what finances mean in real terms. So for instance, she talks about how Darcy is worth £10,000, and having £10,000 would probably mean you have a certain amount of wealth that enables you to keep a house in town, say, whereas if you're worth £100 a year, that would kind of give you one servant. So the Miss Bates had to sort of live off their £100, and they only have one very overworked servant. And having £1,000, I think she said, was equivalent to you can keep a carriage. So it's just really interesting to see what these numbers actually mean in terms of how they'll behave socially. So Alison also talks about how Fanny Price is really worried for her cousin Edmund potentially marrying Mary Bertram, because Mary wants to, not Mary Bertram, oh, sorry, that's incest, Mary Crawford. She wants to, when she's married, keep a house in town, but Edward's income is only worth sort of £1,400, so nowhere near enough to keep a house. So Fanny sort of highlights potential for financial ruin if they were to marry, because they just simply could not live within their means. So yes, that's on YouTube, and so it should be very easy to find.
Yeah, and I suppose if they want any more information, then there's always Emma Clary's.
Oh yeah, here's
Jane
one
Austen,
I made earlier.
Sister.
Yeah. So like Hazel's book, we also sell it in our shop online. And yeah, this is really excellent, actually. Really, really great sort of dual biography of Jane and Henry Austen.
Yeah, interesting. So quickly speaking about biography, what did you think of Henry's? Yeah, Henry's biography.
Yeah, Henry. I mean, because he's sort of that phrase, "Nothing disturbed the smooth course of her life," or that's sort of a line that's bandied around quite a lot. And obviously, anyone who knows about Jane Austen's life knows how very untrue that is, being shouted pillar to post and not having a home until sort of a permanent home after leaving Steventon until much later in life. But yes, it's very sanitized, it's very whitewashed, and sort of several people have sort of said, who is this paragon of virtue? I certainly don't recognize her.
Yes.
And it's interesting, people talking about recognition and saying, this isn't the Austen I know, and oh no, I consider Austen to be sort of a moniker of Lizzie Bennet, almost. Like lots of people are saying that. So I was having a conversation with Deanna and Juliet and Virginia, and we were talking about Henry Austen maybe making a more marketable version of Jane Austen for the Victorian public, because if she's more sort of fits their ideal version, then it'll sell more books. Because if you think about poor Mary Wollstonecraft, when Godwin wrote his memoir about her, she was the very
sales.
Yeah, exactly. It did, because they were so scandalized by having a child out of wedlock and her attempted suicides, and so they just couldn't bear it. So she was sort of completely or nearly lost until she was sort of rediscovered and reclaimed.
Yeah, I think that idea, the kind of ideal that Henry was trying to sell as well, is something that came up a bit in my conversation with Jean Andrews about this kind of discrepancy between the Georgian woman that Jane Austen probably was, with those kind of ideals of Georgian womanhood, and how those ideals were changing at the start of the 19th century, and perhaps influenced the kind of representation Henry wrote of her that was more going towards that kind of angel in the house idea that we get later in the century, especially the piety, which I think a lot of people said, this isn't something I recognise in Jane, specifically, especially with her representation of Mr. Collins and the kind of reverend characters, vicars and things. So yeah, I think that's something that quite a few people found quite interesting.
Yes, but I mean, so she does go in for the clergy a lot in her books, but of course she was the daughter of a clergyman, so I think religion was so part of their everyday lives, so her sort of religion wouldn't have been as sort of that comment she probably would have approved of, I'd say, whereas obviously now as a society we're far more secular, so it takes a lot of people back, I think.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, no, absolutely right. I'm not sure I have much more to add to that. In terms of representations, then, sorry, were you going to say something else?
Oh, well, just going back to both of us have sort of said like our own recognition, like we don't recognize this version of Jane Austen, and it's astounding that all of us feel we know and recognize her. Like Jane Austen is so personal to so many of us, whether you're an Austenite, a Janeite, or just a fan. It's funny, a few people were sort of saying I'm not a Janeite, but and then sort of so we should all claim our proud Janeiteness anyway. But so it's funny, we all think we know her, but really we know so little about her because of these early biographies. Sort of we're careful to keep it under wraps, and I think maybe that's part of where the power of it comes from. Jane Austen has become a blank slate upon which we can all kind of project our own views and opinions onto.
No, I think you're right. I think that's something I was going to say earlier, that I thought was really interesting when we were talking about sort of Henry, and we now sort of seem to think we know less about the brothers than we do about Jane herself, but actually we don't know that much about her, and she is a blank canvas, and I think she, because of the nature of her writing, she becomes quite a friend to the people who read her, and I know it's been mentioned time and time again, the kind of relatability of her writing and how people learn something new from it every time. But I think that kind of blank canvas idea is something that really has helped her to become this myth that is in the title of the course, and has kept her made her such a celebrity and kept her in print for so long as well.
Yes, and long may it continue.
Yes, absolutely. So lastly, I think we were just going to just talk a bit about those portraits and the kind of, especially with regard to the different ideas that people have of Jane, and how we perhaps feel about some of those portraits, and whether we feel that they're the right kind of Jane, or especially the ones that have perhaps a little more tentative provenance. Which ones did you like?
Well, so a lot of people really liked in the comments the Rice portrait, which is the one which to me I find utterly astounding that anyone could possibly believe it's Jane. I suppose because it portrays this very beautiful young girl, and she seems very vivacious and lively, but sort of very serene and dignified at the same time. So again, it kind of fits our ideal. But I mean, even just Jane Austen, if you're looking at the clothing, it's sort of Regency, but the girl depicted is sort of 10 or 11, really. She looks very, very young. So there's no way so Jane Austen was sort of born in 1775, so it would have still been late 18th century when that portrait, for the age to fit, would be right. But the clothes are sort of for when she must be well into adulthood. And also it's such a beautiful, well put together painting that a clergyman's daughter simply would not have had such a beautiful portrait. The only one who has like a really grand portrait is Edward Austen Knight on his grand tour, and of course he's been sort of adopted, for lack of a better word, by the Knights. So it seemed to be the one that everyone liked the most, but to me is just could never be Jane Austen. I mean, I love the Paula Byrne one. I'm all for believing that one is, you know,
yes,
because
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that sort of, it just looks quite sort of the right style, the right age, and how I imagine Jane Austen. But then here we go, like we're all sort of filling in our own blank versions of it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the Byrne portrait is the one that I like the most. I think she seems so sure of herself in a way that perhaps she wasn't necessarily. Although I think she was quite witty and sure of herself in her letters, but it's her in her kind of authorial capacity in her real life. I'm not sure that she had that that kind of assuredness of character public facing, but as a portrait of her like writing and enjoying her own kind of private experience you have when you're writing, I think it's just such a lovely portrait. That and she's certainly got a kind of gravitas and character about her that I really like, and I think fits well really well with her writing.
Yes, and also just the nose is quite beaky, and I think the Austens did have quite beaky noses, because of sort of, you look at Francis's and Francis Austen's portrait, and Edward Austen Knight's, obviously I see a lot, and Fanny as well. Like they all have. I think the Austens had quite a strong nose, strong Roman nose. So and that one does as well. So I sort of think, I think it looks like her, but then of course, what do we know? Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Well then, thank you all for all of your comments and engaging with all the discussion. It's been really exciting this week and last week, and we're really looking forward to next week. I think it's really fun for us to learn from everything that you guys all say, and the kind of experiences you have of Jane Austen. We're always learning something new. So thank you so much for just engaging and discussing, and we look forward to keeping on our discussion with you next week. And yeah, we will see you in the message boards. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.